From whole body unified force and skewing postures, I now want to make a shift. We'll come back to that, of course. This is the whole point of the holistic method. We've got to circle back to those things when we understand a little bit more of the rest of the constellation. But for now, I want to make an enormous shift across the constellation to an ancient star. And this is the relationship between passive and active, something that you will hear talked about all the time in the old Wushu manuals. And as an ancient star, it's got vast implications that are both simple and sublime. So, which one to start with first? Well, let's take the doctrine of the mean and start somewhere in the middle. And it follows on fairly neatly from the discussion that we were having before about whole body unified force and about that moving into and aiding and developing Fa Li. And Wang Xiangjai talks about this in terms of developing a springy overall structure, and he talks about the idea of stored force being not just the way that we bend our joints to create the potential for movement, but the overall consistency between those joints. And when we say consistency in this sense, we mean tension in the body, or finding the right balance between relaxation and tension. But you've got to get your mind around this idea that Hansi Huang was talking about in the previous instalment, of there being this very complex relationship between different groups of muscles. So some are tense, some are relaxed, and that creates a springiness over the entirety of the body. And to make this clear, I can just read a little bit of a passage from Wang Xiangjai himself, and he says, quote, "To achieve this, the joints and the folding parts of the body during combat must form obtuse triangular shapes. This geometry produces pre-tension. Whether the opponent launches punches or kicks, by interrupting the trajectory of their force with a slight displacement, the pre-tension generated by the triangular structure can disperse their concentrated force. As my strikes are evenly distributed and evenly interrupted, the opponent will struggle to withstand them. The triangle not only creates pre-tension, but also facilitates the collaboration of various forces, making it a fundamental principle of Da Cheng Chuan. Any formed triangle on the body constitutes a point of force. This concept is critical to generating and receiving force." End quote. So you get an idea there of what he means by springy triangular force, the joints bent, and what he's talking about in terms of pre-tension, not pretension, pre-tension is what we normally translate as stored force now. And I think that this is responsible for a little bit of the confusion that we sometimes see with people who are interested in, or even sometimes teaching Yiquan, where they think of stored force either as some kind of mystical energy. Well, that's absolutely not what Wang Xiangjai means, and he makes that explicitly clear. But sometimes people say it means the pressure that's created when your arms or part of your body presses against someone else in a sparring or push hands or drill type situation. And again, Wang Xiangjai is explicitly clear that that's not what it is, but it can exist within that situation because it's just the pre-tension, i.e. the level and degree of consistency. Remember that interlinking of the muscles in that triangular force. That can be when you're in contact with someone, or it can just be before you punch someone. But I think the confusion itself does come from Wang Xiangjai and the way that he talks about Yiquan, the way that he thinks about Yiquan. And I want to talk about this in depth another time, but I can mention it here. In this overall same passage where he's talking about triangular force, he's also making it explicitly clear that Yiquan is about self-defense, not offense. So you will have seen possibly all of these discussions about the unity of attack and defense, and people talking about... Very often, it's people who only ever put the gloves on to do the washing up have got a lot of theories about what would happen if they ever did try and use their Yiquan in a practical circumstance. And they will often say things like, well, I don't need defence, I don't need any kind of defensive skill because I'm just going to be offensive and offence is the best defence, or some version of that that excuses their lack of training in defence. And however we understand the unity of attack and defence, one thing's for absolutely sure, and that's that Wang Xiangjai doesn't say anything like offence is the best kind of defence, or that Yiquan's approach to defense is to use offense. He doesn't say anything like that. In fact, he says the exact opposite. He says that defense is the best form of offense in Yiquan because it's a self-defense based scenario. You don't have to take my word for it. I'll just tell you what he says about this. And again, this is from his book on breaking hands. Quote, in Da Cheng Chuan's combat, the primary aim is not offensive, but rather self-defense. Thus, breaking hands in Da Cheng Chuan focuses on interrupting the opponent's attacks and maintaining defense with the intent of breaking the incoming attack. Skill in defense is skill in attack. End quote. So he's pretty much almost literally saying the opposite of offense is the best form of defense. He's saying that defense is the key thing. Defense is the basis of offense in Yiquan. And through doing that, he makes his life a lot easier, I have to say, because it's a lot easier to make those breaking hands techniques work when someone moves in and attacks you. And think back to that discussion I had about Lemeshev, the Russian boxer, who was brilliant at defense but couldn't attack. And that really opens up a wider discussion about, well, maybe we need to think a little bit beyond the way Wang Xingjia is thinking about it there, because there are lots of situations where, and even self-defense situations, where you have to proactively engage and attack. You can't just rely on an opponent moving in. But we'll come back to all of that. For now, let's think about, again, someone stood in the basic holding the ball posture. And now we understand that this isn't just about holding the posture, it's about generating this appropriate form of bodily consistency where you have pre-tension, or as we usually call it now, or usually translate it, stored force. And think back to that other stage of the logical model where we were thinking about the need to move very fast to generate velocity, draw in a lot of our body mass into that, and then use that equation to create the kinetic force that we're going to use to throw a punch. And as part of that process, we need to relax our posture ever so slightly, ever so briefly, relax so that we can do that explosive movement. And that just takes place in a split second. But that way of thinking about it then makes us think that, well, we need to be in a completely relaxed state all the time. And then we thought about, well, no, we can't do that because for defensive reasons, we need to maintain this overall springy structure. But now we want to think a little bit beyond that, because I think that tends to make us think that that's a compromise, and that because we're bringing tension into our body to maintain that springy structure, that we're then having the knock-on effects of slowing down the potential for explosive movement, just like we did when we tried to solve the problem of having a floppy arm by bringing tension into the body. But that's not actually how this works. When we maintain the correct bodily consistency, that correct level of pre-tension or stored force in the body, it takes our, if you like, our state of readiness up to an entirely different level. Think about all those exercises we've been doing where we've been holding postures in stillness, but we've been visualizing pushing against something or else pushing out along particular vectors. And we talked about that idea of holding movement within stillness, that this is one of the very important meanings of that concept, that even though the posture itself is completely still, nevertheless, we feel like we're moving. We feel like we're initiating and capturing movement itself, just like, remember that I said if you're pushing against a wall, you're not moving, but all of the potential for motion is frozen in that moment. Now, at this stage of the logical model, we've got to take all of that onto the next level where it becomes, well, the example that's very often given is a sprinter in the blocks waiting for the starting gun to go off. And I've said I don't really like that analogy because it puts all the emphasis on the legs. We want that feeling in the whole body. And we begin to move with it, and this is what we call holding the center. So we've contained that feeling. That stored force is like the moment the starting gun fires and then you go, and it's a completely different feeling to the feeling that we normally have in daily life. And this is one of the things that gives martial artists of any kind better reactions than other people, that you start moving towards this ability. But when we move into this concept of holding the center, then our whole body becomes alive with this feeling. It becomes alive with the potential for movement. So it's storing all of that force. It's not just about joints being bent. It's about the very physical feeling of potential when we get this correct form of consistency that's alive with the potential for movement. And it's difficult to describe because it's a feeling. But remember in the previous episodes that we said you can see it. You can see it in people's movements. You can see the aliveness and you can see the reaction time when they move. And this is called holding the centre, and this is the fifth context. It's the baseline from which everything else, whether that be attack or defence, is launched. But that's a very mundane way of thinking about it. I like to think about it much more excitingly as a kind of super active dialectic between passive and active. They're flickering from one to the other so fast, and the potential just to explode. The moment that it's touched, it will just explode in explosive force. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Wang Xiangjia is talking about, where someone touches you and it just boom, this whole thing just explodes in movement. There's no time to think about it. There's no time to really use any kind of preset technique, although the body will follow along the preset techniques that you've practiced. And if you think Wang Xiangjia doesn't tell you to do that, I'm telling you he does. He just says don't practice too many techniques. And I can read out the quote here. So, quote, regardless of whether one is conscious of it or not, all styles of combat adhere to a common principle, minimizing energy expenditure while maximizing combat efficiency. To achieve this, it's best to train the instinctive vitality minimally but comprehensively, simplifying form and deepening meaning. Once this vitality reaches a certain level of refinement, one should focus on mastering one or two techniques, practicing until they become as natural as an infant suckling. This state is known as seeking the celestial axis. End quote. In any case, we can come back to all of that. For now, let's move on. That's our really complex thing that we needed to think about, just to round out our understanding of the stuff we were looking at the previous level of the logical model. Now we need to go to something much more basic, and this is kinetic force itself. So let's imagine we've been following Wang Xiangjia's advice exactly, and remember that most of his students, if not all of his students, radically changed that training program, so they didn't just have people doing standing to develop that feeling before practicing techniques, which is what Wang Xiangjia is recommending there. And let's say that you've done all of that and then your teacher dies and you're suddenly left there thinking, well, what do I do now? How would I actually use my body to affect the outside world? The problematic that Han Yiquan raises in the previous episode, we discussed this. And let's imagine that this person has no clue whatsoever. They don't even know how to form a fist or why you would do that. They're just thinking, well, how do I use my body mass to somehow affect someone else in a martial arts situation? And there are really only two options here, because due to our Wuda, we've already established that there's no magical force that's going to suddenly emerge from us like the Emperor in Star Wars and blast someone away. So we're left with only the rules that apply within the universe, the laws of physics and the realities of physiology. And I can mention in passing here, by the way, that you've got to be careful with how Wang Xiangjia says things and then sometimes how they're translated. So he gives very detailed, very specific explanations of how movements work. And it's clear from those explanations that he thinks about them in, well, we can say mundane, but the way is not far from the people. It's the mundane things that have the most profound implications. But they're very mechanical, straightforward ways. There's no exotic forces or anything like that. But then he'll make a comment about something like, or what he's saying literally is something like, we only use the natural forces that exist in the universe, or what we would say like the natural laws of physics or something like that. And that very often gets translated as things like use cosmic forces, which obviously from the perspective of a 1960s hippie counterculture, something like cosmic forces has a completely different connotation that then feeds into new age belief systems, and then from there on into the idea of exotic forces or some kind of mystical powers. And it's clear from his descriptions and also from passages elsewhere where he talks about people who talk about things like that, that he's absolutely fundamentally horrified by all of that kind of stuff and thinks that it's nonsense. Similarly, he talks about the mass of human bodies and the way that they function. And we saw in a previous quote, he describes internal forces as the mechanical forces inside the body. And when he's talking about the mass of the body and how it's working with velocity and cosmic forces, he says things that get translated into things like gravity waves and stuff like that. And really, these are just idioms that have become lost in translation. He's always talking in the context of the laws of physics and the realities of human physiology. And the same applies for us. So if we want to exert force against another body, we've really only got two choices. The first one is just to use gravity. So imagine, let's say we're holding the ball posture, and we simply fall over and use our weight to land on another person. And that's not something to be looked down on. That's exactly or pretty much the principle that happens, for example, when we do a sprawl. So someone goes for a takedown and you drop your weight on them. And also, it's the same principle that's used to subdue people, or when you're wrestling, to put all your weight on someone, to take the wind out of someone. And of course, it's also used in law enforcement, psychiatric hospitals, very controversially, because lots of people have been suffocated and killed just by having the weight of someone else pressing down upon them. So that's by no means a nothing technique, it's a serious technique, but that's not what we're interested in at the moment. What we need to focus on right now is how we go from using that springy force to then generating kinetic force. So this is the other way that we can create force, using our own body to generate kinetic force. And that's what we're going to look at next.